economic, and social order in which they're situated. Before we can evaluate the media's democratic credentials, it is necessary to examine the ecological factors that affect their performance. On the surface, the fundamentals underpinning democratic governance appear ideal. The legislative and policy frameworks governing the media are among some of the most progressive on the continent. The Constitution protects free expression, media freedoms and independence, and guarantees easy establishment and access to media. The Constitution also protects media owners and publishers from governmental interference and establishes the National Media Commission to, amongst other things, insulate the state-owned media, in particular, from governmental control. At the same time, the Constitution expects the media to discharge certain responsibilities in line with democratic principles. Thus, for example, it stipulates that state-owned media must afford fair opportunities and facilities for the presentation of divergent views and dissenting opinions. It also enjoins the media to uphold the principles, provisions, and objectives of the Constitution, and to uphold the responsibility and accountability of the government to the people of Ghana. Some of these constitutional provisions, Madam Chair, have been tested in court. For example, court rulings on state media have affirmed their independence from governmental control through the manner of appointment of the boards and the heads of such institutions. The courts in MPP versus Ghana Broadcasting Corporation also affirmed the right of oppositional voices to access state media. And in 2015, the courts also ruled that censorship of the media through content regulation that was proposed by the National Media Commission was unconstitutional. The legal regime for media was also improved when in 2000, criminal libel and sedition was repealed by a unanimous vote in Parliament. More recently, in 2019, after several years of lobbying by advocates, the Right to Information Act was passed, giving all citizens, not just the media, the right to obtain information, documents, or data from governmental institutions without being compelled to provide reasons. A number of rulings from the RTI Commission has been favorable to petitioners seeking information from governmental and public institutions and have affirmed this right. For example, in July 2021, the RTI Commission ruled that the Minerals Commission's demand of $1,000 fee to provide information to an online newspaper, the Fourth Estate, was against their right to public information and ordered instead that the publication pay only 1 cedi 90 pesos. Similarly, the Commission intervened in an RTI application to a journalist requesting information on the budgetary allocations given to the Ghana Police Service. The police had refused to honor the request. Following the petition to the RTI, the Commission wrote to the Ghana Police asking them to release their requested information and subsequently fining them 50,000 Ghana cedis in February this year for refusing to comply. Still, Madam Chair, the lack of any broadcasting legislation is a glaring lacuna in the country's regulatory system, which critics argue is mostly responsible for excesses in the broadcast space. In April 2021, 2 teenagers in Kaswa were alleged to have been influenced by content on television to kill an 11-year-old boy for ritual purposes. The incident renewed calls for stronger regulation of broadcast content, with the government responding by reactivating a draft broadcast bill which had been on the back burner for years and promising to immediately put the bill before Parliament. 1 year on, we're still waiting. The failure of successive governments to enact a broadcast code, compounded by a lack of transparency in how frequencies are allocated by the NCA, has contributed to the political capture of Ghanaian media and skewed authorization in favor of commercial state applicants to the detriment of other tiers of broadcasting, particularly the community radio sector. Critics charge also that the scramble for an allocation of frequencies to political operatives has resulted in a high saturation of radio stations in big cities and made viability of the radio business challenging. Supervision of the airwaves remains unsettled between the NMC and the NCA. Largely perceived as a dog with a bark but no bite, the NMC, on which I have served on 2 different occasions, has struggled to truly live up to its constitutional mandate of taking all appropriate measures to ensure the establishment and maintenance of the highest journalistic standards in the mass media. The Commission, through its Complaint Settlement Committee, arbitrates grievances against the media, but it has no sanctioning powers of its own to keep errant journalists or media organizations in check. Madam Chair, media production and content are closely linked to ownership. Theoretical positions on the political economy of the media hold that ownership shapes the kinds of information provided by news media and influences media independence, governance, and free speech. It is fair to say that in Ghana, lack of transparency in media ownership, coupled with proprietorial interference, has had a negative influence on the work of the media. Another negative factor has been attacks on journalists and serious threats to free speech, media freedoms, and the safety of journalists. Watchdog groups such as Media Foundation for West Africa and CDD Ghana warn of a deterioration in the civic space in which the media operate. Media Foundation has documented several violations against the media by state and non-state actors. Examples of violations include instances where police or soldiers have detained, assaulted, or threatened journalists or media crew while they were covering stories. The brutal police assault on Joy FM's Latif Idrisu is a case in point. Equally indicting is the still unresolved murder in 2019 of Ahmed Hussein Swale, who worked with investigative journalist Anas Ameria Anas. A more recent example of another egregious attack happened at Radio Ada, a community radio station that has been challenging the lack of transparency and accountability in the privatization of salt lagoons and advocating for better governance in the extraction of Ada's natural resource, which is salt. Madam Chair, physical, verbal, and psychological attacks and reprisals against journalists, or even the fear of violence, has a chilling effect on journalism practice. They encourage self-censorship by journalists as well as their sources. The media are also under attack from economic forces, and many newsrooms are struggling to survive. A variety of factors account for this. Fierce competition from digital media, for example, poor capitalization, and overcrowded media space, and fragmented audiences. And this has led to a decline in sources of revenue for legacy media. And this already precarious condition has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has resulted in constricting revenue sources even further and led to job losses across the media industry. The result of all this, Madam Chair, is not just an inability for the media industry to attract the brightest and best needed for quality journalism to thrive. It provides a convenient excuse for unprofessional behavior, such as solid or brown envelope, and for easy co-optation of journalists by political and business actors. To quote former City FM journalist Nana Ama Ajimana Sante, and I quote, "Combine low pay with high risk, and the outlook becomes bleak. How many business journalists would be willing to investigate and report the corrupt or harmful dealings of a company when they've been taking solely from them for years? How many political journalists will be able to expose corruption or scandals involving politicians who contributed to their rent, or be critical of the political party that funded their education?" Madam Chair, critics of the media some of whom are at the same time their staunchest allies, have leveled a litany of accusations against them. The media in Ghana have been accused of being partisan, polarized, factionalized, unprofessional, and unethical. Some of these criticisms date back to the beginning of Ghana's democratic journey, when an unfettered media was considered more tolerable than a changed one. And Professor Diamonds captured it very well in a lecture he did in memory of P.A. Biansa, when he talked about going from a culture of silence to a culture of noise. The concerns then, as now, include sloppiness in reporting, lack of verification to establish facts, peddling of falsehoods, biased reporting, uninformed opinionating masquerading as fact, weak research and analytical capacity, sensationalism aimed at boosting sales, and checkbook journalism. Of particular concern to my feminist sensibilities also has been gendered coverage, including the perpetuation of gender stereotypes and sexist attitudes that prop up patriarchal norms within society, as well as inattention to issues of concern to women. Little wonder surveys such as the Afrobarometer indicate a decline in trust and popular support for media in Ghana, similar to what was found in other African countries. Madam Chair, although strong allegations have been leveled against the media and public trust in them seems to be wavering, there's plenty of evidence also to show that the media have played and continue to play very positive roles within Ghanaian society. I hope to make this clear when I examine how they have discharged their normative functions as set out by Christians et al., namely the monitorial role, the radical role, the facilitative role, and the collaborative role. I will also discuss their performance on the role referred to as the cultural glue role. Madam Chair, the monitorial role requires journalists to perform a number of functions. One, to play a surveillance role by monitoring the environment and providing relevant information to people on what is happening around them and on trends and threats. It also demands that they collect feedback on public responses to, for example, government policies. The media's performance on this score, Madam Chair, has been mixed. They've done reasonably well in providing critical information to the public on a wide range of issues and deserve commendation for special reports that spotlight non-functioning systems, for example, poor infrastructure, security, and service provision. On a routine basis, the media also provide us with information on key governance institutions such as Parliament, the Presidency, and district assemblies. The media have also been especially effective during key democratic moments like elections by informing voters about parties, programs, candidates, and issues, and providing civic education about the electoral system and arrangements. They also do well monitoring voting processes and reporting on election results, exposing electoral irregularities, and generally bringing transparency to electoral contests. However, the quality of information and even the type of information they provide can be superficial, sometimes not what we need to help us make informed decisions. Audience surveys have suggested citizens want information on issues such as health, education, environment, and sanitation, but most often it is partisan politics which dominates the airwaves. Climate change has been described as an existential threat, but you wouldn't know that if you consumed Ghanaian media. Much too often, journalists do not use their analytical skills in reporting on systemic structural failures. Ajimana Santi, for example, has accused them of failing to predict the banking crisis of 2017. And the reason may be what broadcast journalist Bernard Avler offered in a CDD Krontini Akwamu lecture he delivered in 2020. The fact that some key media houses were owned by banks, some of which were amongst the ones that failed. Time Tied to the monitorial role is the often invoked watchdog role of the media that demands them to act as a check on the abuse of power, bring transparency to public life, and seek accountability not only from political and public officials, but from non-state actors such as businesses, non-governmental organizations, and religious bodies as well. There are many examples where the media have been influential in exacting accountability and pressuring politicians and other duty bearers to provide information to justify actions and policies. Investigative reporters such as Anas Amaria Anas, Manasseh Azure, Kwesi Nete, Francisca Enchil, etc. have exposed corruption in institutions like the Ghana Procurement Authority, the Health Ministry in the recent Sputnik vaccine scandal, the erstwhile Savannah Accelerated Development Authority, SADA, the Ghana Youth Employment and Entrepreneurial Development Agency, GIDA, private businesses, and even in the judiciary. I'll now turn to the radical role. The Socratic notion of democracy, Madam Chair, rests on two important principles: equality and freedom. The radical role draws from that and calls for the media to strive for equality and justice and the elimination of concentrations of social power within society so that all, especially the socially marginalized, can be included in societal decisions. As Nancy Fraser puts it, people ought to think the media speak for them. The radical role, therefore, calls for the media to proactively advocate for the respect of human rights and rule of law, which are enshrined in our Constitution, and for the media to be in a position to question power, including traditional authority, on actions that are incompatible with democratic practice. This social justice rule also includes agitating for market reforms to address imbalances in wealth. A cursory assessment will suggest the media have shown some commitment to equality and freedom and not shied away from demanding equal access to social services or for things to be done according to the rule of law. Journalists have exposed the abuse of human rights of citizens by security forces and victimization of people in the workplace. Media coverage has also demonstrated support for ethnic inclusiveness and gender and economic empowerment. News reports have highlighted social exclusion of people living with disabilities, the stigmatization of people living with HIV/AIDS, and earlier on in the pandemic, stigma against those who had caught COVID-19 disease. But as my colleagues, Abena Yebu-Abaning and Ivy Fofie and I found out in research we conducted in collaboration with ALMA, as an industry, the media itself does not demonstrate gender equality. Our research showed that in the first place, the media business is almost entirely male. Only a couple of women own media organizations. There are also few women in decision-making positions, such as on the boards of media companies or in top management positions. We also found that newsrooms can be inhospitable spaces for women to work in for a number of reasons, including the failure to sanction sexual harassment or enact policies to deter such unacceptable behavior. Madam Chair, in the midst of plenty, rural communities are still underserved by media. They have at their disposal only rudimentary communication systems called compacts, community address systems, because many rural areas are not considered financially viable for media investments. And even though the media have improved coverage on disabilities over the years, some newsrooms are simply inaccessible to physically challenged persons because no lifts have been provided for ease of mobility and no arrangements in place for visually or hearing impaired persons to participate in programs. Madam Chair, most perniciously, the media, particularly social media, have acted as accelerants of hate against certain social groups, notably in recent times, members of the LGBTQ+ community. Journalists have betrayed their own biases against sexual minorities by stereotyping and denigrating them in their coverage, by failing to give them adequate opportunity to defend their rights, and generally failing to challenge those who seek to trample on their human rights. It has been disappointing to see how reluctant the media have been to call out traditional authorities, or traditional leaders rather, who threaten to ban citizens perceived as LGBTQ+ from their towns and villages. I, of course, have had direct experience of these injustices as a member of a group of 18 persons who sent a memorandum to Parliament against the proposed anti-homosexuality bill. Not only have we been verbally lynched in social media at times, but at times the attack has been carefully orchestrated by legacy media practitioners. Our mostly Christian newsrooms, especially those located in southern Ghana, also perpetuate forms of inequality against other religions, particularly our own traditional religions, as they either neglect to cover them or adopt a negative tone towards them in their reports. One of the complaints we received when I served on the National Media Commission was from traditional religion adherents who wanted us to restrain a radio station in Georgia from constantly vilifying their religion. Madam Chair, it bears reminding that no matter a journalist's religious convictions, ethnic loyalties, or political views, they have an obligation to educate the public that part of living in a democracy is to tolerate views and values that may go against their own. I now turn to the facilitative role. Participatory democracy is underpinned by the notion of an active dialogical public sphere shaped by a variety of actors whose opinions and attitudes guide governance. The facilitative role required of the media is therefore rooted in expectations that the media will provide an inclusive public space for pluralistic debate and civic engagement on public affairs so that the collective wisdom of society would inform governance. Implicit in the facilitative role is also a mobilizing role requiring the media to rally and encourage public learning and participation in, for example, political processes such as elections. In Ghana, civic participation in public affairs has been greatly facilitated by the multiplicity of spaces now available for citizens to comment on social and governance issues. The very nature of social media, which allows for people to express themselves without traditional gatekeepers, has meant marginalized voices, as well as minority, even unpopular viewpoints, can be accommodated in public discourse. Social media has proven a useful tool for social mobilization around a range of issues, also especially through hashtag campaigns. In addition, the legacy media have facilitated access to CSOs, social movements, interest groups, and individuals to pressure for social change and reforms. Madam Chair, although Ghana's mediascape appears rich because of the plethora of media available, in reality there's little diversity in the character and context on offer, whether in local language or English language. And as one journalist points out, and I quote, Ghanaian mainstream media is dominated by a narrow set of ideas, often pro-business, neoliberal, and capitalist. Even discussions and stories about marginalized groups are dominated by the political class and elite, increasingly the loyal class, unquote. It is a constitutional obligation for the media to cover and moderate dissenting views, but they rarely accommodate radical views that challenge the social order and are sometimes too quick to acquiesce to state excuses that the question of certain dissenting voices is justified in the national interest. Madam Chair, the gendered nature of the media and lack of diversity of voices is exemplified in the lack of women as expert sources in the news and the tendency towards manels. And manels are media panels that are mostly composed of men. A Media Foundation monitoring report on the level of involvement and participation of women in public discourse on radio in Ghana showed 83% of the time it is male voices that are heard on discussion programs. The study found also that only 11% of expert sources interviewed on radio and television in Ghana are women. The media's discriminatory tendencies towards women is confirmed in a more recent study where it was found that on mixed panels, male panelists were given more time to speak and treated with more respect than women. The study also found that men's knowledge was not questioned as much as women's knowledge when they appeared in the media. Newsroom practices continue to ignore women's societal constraints in the design of news programs. When, for example, the media invite women to appear on shows at short notice or come on late-night shows, they fail to consider that in Ghana's conservative society, women sometimes face difficulties accommodating professional and household roles without advance notice. Furthermore, societal attitudes towards outspoken women can also discourage many from participating in talk shows, particularly shows that are needlessly confrontational. I turn to the collaborative role. The collaborative role prescribed for the media is often perceived as contentious and suggestive of collusion between media and the state. This is partly because journalistic independence is seen in liberal democratic practice as being upheld when the relationship between journalists and the power elite is adversarial rather than friendly. But those who support this role, the collaborative role, counter that the media must be used to promote state interests that coincide with the interests of the public. In developing countries such as Ghana, collaboration between the media and state institutions is desirable for developmental purposes. For example, during natural disasters, public health campaigns, and when the state is faced with threats from external enemies. As my mentor Kwame Kakari observed, and I quote, "Traditional media have in totality helped national development through social mobilization in times of need, such as during national emergencies and the COVID-19 fight." Madam Chair, I must caution, however, that the media ought to avoid becoming government apologists by striking a careful balance between their collaborative role and their watchdog role. The final role of the media, Madam Chair, that I will discuss today risks being perceived as contrary to journalistic neutrality as well. The cultural glue role was not identified in the typology of roles advanced by Christian et al. And is hardly included in discussions on media's normative roles in democratic society. It is, however, worth considering in the context of Africa, given the danger of polarization along ethnic and religious lines resulting from the historical composition of African nation states by Western powers. Madam Chair, this role perceives the media as vital in the preservation and propagation of the culture of a people, and assigns it the responsibility of preserving tradition and promoting a common cultural heritage in the interest of future generations. In post-colonial Ghana, one of the tasks of the Ghana Broadcasting Corporation was to promote a common national identity while protecting and preserving the cultural diversities of people. The state broadcaster did this by constantly playing national songs, showing different local cultures, and broadcasting news in various local languages as a way of projecting Ghana's identity as a multicultural but unified country. By acting as a cultural unifier that brings people from diverse ethnicities together and highlighting the common norms and values that define them as a unique people, the media can promote tolerance and coexistence and play a constructive role during conflicts. In Ghana, where there are low-intensity communal conflicts and a propensity for violence during electoral contestations, a deliberate forging of unity is crucial for democratic survival. We have seen how media messages stoked ethnic divisions in countries such as Rwanda and Kenya. Comparatively, the Ghanaian media have acted responsibly in circumstances that potentially could have exacerbated more tensions within society. And an example of this is how the media covered the crisis in Dagbon immediately after the murder of the Yana. The cultural glue role of media can also act as a pushback against the foisting of beliefs and values from the global north on the global south. This often happens through the flow of cultural goods like news and information and popular media, films, music, etc. Madam Chair, we live in an intensely globalized world where Western imperialism is difficult to counter. The media in Ghana have a particularly important duty to consciously produce content to stem Western domination in the media that we consume. Many media organizations, particularly television, however, find it easier and cheaper to fill airtime with imported programs, sometimes dubbed in local languages, rather than to invest in local programs that better reflect Ghanaian national identities and cultural life. Lack of investment in covering our own is also mirrored in how poorly the media covers neighboring countries. So we look to BBC to tell us what is happening in the small West African country of Togo. Madam Chair, so what is the way forward? There are still lots of other burning questions relating to the media and Ghana's democratic journey. The issues raised here are part of a continuum of conversations that we must keep on having as we struggle to consolidate Ghana's democracy. Ghanaian journalists work in challenging circumstances and lack the resources to provide the kinds of robust coverage necessary to fulfill some of the normative roles I've just discussed. But as I have shown, journalism practice in Ghana demonstrates a lot of potential. Mainly because of the checkered political history of Ghana, the media is so young in terms of democratic practice. Many journalists are inexperienced, lacking requisite knowledge on the areas they cover, and do not have a strong sense of history. But as a key pillar of democracy, the media sector is too important to fail. It needs a bailout on several fronts. Firstly, the environment in which media operate must be improved. No matter the laws in place, journalists must feel safe and confident to do their job without fear of attacks. Whether state or non-state actors, those who violate media rights ought to be held accountable and sanctioned. It's the only way to reduce impunity. Secondly, there's need for introspection on the part of the media and genuine attempts to address the litany of complaints that diminish people's trust in them. Without popular support for civic freedoms, there's a risk that authoritarian-minded governments will place further restrictions aimed at weakening the media's ability to hold them accountable. Thirdly, if the media are expected to be guardians of democracy, they themselves must deepen their commitment to democratic ideals. Media development organizations, media activists, and scholars must consciously seek to engage those in the media chain, from owners to cab reporters, to develop stronger understandings of why the media must work in the public interest and in support of democratic development. Fourthly, there have been many attempts by organizations within and outside academia to build the capacity of media practitioners. But the media industry itself must invest more in building the capacity of their employees. There are few investigative journalists in Ghana, for example, and most media organizations are unwilling to allocate resources for investigative journalism or sustained coverage of issues of high salience. Capacity building must also include building skills to cover specialized topics like the environment, science, and technology, which affect people in such profound ways. These trainings must also aim at helping to build a more equitable society by addressing gendered media content and encouraging the media to enhance coverage on the marginalized and socially excluded. Madam Chair, efforts to improve media professional standards of ethics must also be strengthened to ward off hostile external regulation. This means media companies and media associations such as GJA, GCRN, and GIBA must encourage self-regulation and hold their employees and members more accountable when they contravene professional and ethical norms. Finally, I acknowledge that some of the media reforms I'm suggesting will need financial resources. Media businesses are already under strain, but they must look for new models and find more innovative ways of survival. The Ghanaian media are not alone in this predicament. Branko Brickkick, editor-in-chief of the South African newspaper Daily Maverick, was reported as advocating for a major philanthropic infusion of about $1 billion a year to support journalism around the world. He was quoted as arguing that, and I quote, "Fixing quality media is the cheapest way to fix society." Fixing quality media is the cheapest way to fix society. Madam Chair, I endorse that view. The old model where commercial advertising is the primary source of media funding is obviously atrophied. Other sustainable types of funding, from private philanthropy to public subsidies, must be explored. And Madam Chair, we must remember that the media are a public good and must be supported to survive. If for nothing else, they must survive in the interest of democracy. To quote Professor Alfred Opubo, who was one of the most foremost communication scholars on our continent and a man with whom I had the privilege of serving on the PIWA board with, and I quote, "In the midst of freedom, there may still be chains," unquote. Madam Chair, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'm done with my presentation. Madam Chair, my academic journey has been long, sometimes tedious, but fulfilling, and along the way, there have been many colleagues, friends, and family that have made the journey much easier than it would otherwise have been. I cannot mention all of you by name, but hope you know that I appreciate you all. Many of you are in the audience here. I really appreciate and love you. I'd like to acknowledge, however, a few people who have played significant roles in nurturing, in particular, my academic career. Dr. Lynn Bryden, Professor Kwame Karikari, Professor Leslie Steeves, Professor Jima Buedi, Her Ladyship Professor Henrietta Mensah Bonsu, and Professor Oyeronke Oyewumi. I'd also like to thank my colleagues and staff at the Department of Communication Studies and the School of Information and Communication Studies for their support. In particular, my sincere thanks go to Dr. Gilbert Teta, Dr. Abna Yabua Benin, and Dr. Theodora Dami, who were my sounding board when I was preparing this lecture. I thank you so much for your feedback. I also want to thank Kwame Clevo and my PhD students, Daniela J. and Diana Sebi, who assisted me in various ways during preparation towards this inaugural lecture. Madam Chair, finally, My scholarly journey could not have been possible without the support of my family. My father, Fred Gadzekpo, who left this earth before he could see me mount this stage. Even though he had whispered to my friend and big sister Professor to make sure I followed in her footsteps. You've done your job and you know who you are. We sometimes butted heads on gender norms, as the family will tell you, but one thing was for sure. He believed in equal opportunity for males and females and ensured I was well educated and supported to realize my academic potential. A heart filled with gratitude and love goes to my mother, who is here at this lecture. At the risk of sounding corny, she's the wind beneath my wings, who was always willing to step in anytime I needed help with my daughter, particularly when I was completing my PhD. My three siblings, Frank, Kelly, and Cece, and cousin Foley, who is watching out there, have always been my anchor and always got my back. Thank you for being part of this journey. I'd also like to acknowledge my sisters-in-law, Lynn and Fake, who pitched in more times than I can count when I needed help. Nubuke, my daughter, my handbag. You endured many absences from me from the moment you were born because you dared to come in the middle of my PhD. I thank you. And my other daughter, Paulina, nieces and nephews, Amy, Sedi, Ellie, Mawena, Mifa, I have to call them or otherwise I'm in trouble. Thomas, Chelsea, Amando, Frederica, and Janet. You are part of the reason this lecture is important. Thank you all very, very much.
We thank you as well, Professor Gadzekpo. Thank you very much for such an insightful lecture. At a point, I thought I was sitting in her print journalism class. Please let's give her another round of applause. I invite us all now to relax and enjoy a performance by Ghana Dance and Sound. Thanks very much for the beautiful performance, Ghana Dance Ensemble. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we are now at the point of presentations, but before I move on to that, I would like to acknowledge some personalities here. Some have already been acknowledged by our lecturer for today, and so I'll move on to acknowledge some other officials. We are privileged to have with us the Chancellor of our university, Mrs. Mary Chinwe Hesse, who is seated down there. We also have some of our former Vice-Chancellors with us, Professor Ivan Adai Mensah, Professor C.N.B. Tego, I think Justice Henrietta Mensah Bonsu has already been acknowledged, but she's seated there so she can give us a wave. We also have Professor Ernest Dumo, former member of Electoral Commission and former head of the National Identification Authority. We are also privileged to have with us Dr. Mohamed Ibn Chambers, former president of ECOWAS Commission. And we have Mr. Abdul Yaman Yalu, head of UNESCO Ghana, also here with us. We've also been joined by students from Achimota School, students and staff from Achimota School, where our distinguished lecturer had her secondary education. And we've been joined virtually by Birmingham University as well. Some more groups and individuals will come up while we move on to the presentation. So let me now move on to the presentations. I would like to start with a brief description of where Prof. Gadzekpo is coming from. Prof. Gadzekpo belongs to the Department of Communication Studies, which is situated in the School of Information and Communication Studies, also situated in the College of Education. So that's the hierarchy is the college, the school, and the department. So we are going to go by that. I'll first of all invite representatives of the College of Education to make a presentation to our distinguished professor. College of Education.
Right here.
Okay. Well, may I invite the School of Information and Communication Studies representatives to come up as well. While the Department of Communication Studies gets ready. also invite doctoral students from the Department of Communication Studies, doctoral students and candidates, of which I'm a proud member. I move on to the Center for Gender Studies and Advocacy. Representatives should please come up to do their presentation. While the UG Pan-African Doctoral Academy gets ready, UG PADA should get ready. UG PADA. That's the UG Pan-African Doctoral Academy. So Achimota is really represented fully here. We have Professor Gadzekpo's classmates here. And so on this note, I invite Achimota 78-year group, OAA 78, to come and do their presentation. Yes, we are celebrating a full professor. So at this point, I'll invite the Center for Social Policy Studies staff and faculty from there to make a presentation. Center for Social Policy Studies. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'll move to the immediate family of Professor Gadzekpo. But before I do that, there are some close relations to her also who are listed here. Please permit me to call them to make their presentations. We have Thomas, Foley, and Chelsea. While Amma, Lynn, Brooks, and Georgie get ready to do their presentation. While Amma and her group are coming, can we have Mrs. Ellen Hagan come up to make a presentation on behalf of the S-Girls? Mrs. Ellen Hagan is coming. And at this point, I would like to ask the family of Professor Gadzekpo to get ready. Now the immediate family of Professor Audrey Gadzekpo. Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to announce that we were also joined by our former Vice-Chancellor, Professor Aba Appiah Amfo. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the room is full of deans, directors, former deans, former directors, a whole host of personalities. As our distinguished lecturer said, we cannot mention everyone, but we are very happy you made time to join us. And so we acknowledge all of you. You are all our special guests, and we are very happy you joined us, both physically and virtually. At this point, we'd like to take Madam Chair, your kind permission to invite Dubawa Ghana to make a presentation to Professor Gadzekpo. Please permit me to break this protocol. So before we take the closing remarks from our chairperson. I invite Dubawa Ghana to make a presentation to Professor Gadzekpo. Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me to welcome our chairperson to the podium to deliver her closing remarks.
Madam Chancellor, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure that you agree with me that it's been an exciting evening. Professor Audrey Gadzekpo, this evening you brought to this hall scholars of national and international repute, distinguished personalities from the judiciary, the media, civil society organizations, government and para-government organizations, and then the Achimotans also came. When they were singing the anthem, it was like the whole hall was full of Achimotans and singing along. Thank you very much for affording us this opportunity. You know, scholars can be very interesting persons. They can be very much in your faces, very interrogating every single issue. Sometimes you think a matter is straightforward, but they have something to interrogate about that. And then activists are also persistent and insistent persons. Now, when you find all of these in one person, I am not sure how those who are always close to that person are able to contain and manage that. But it's a rare opportunity, and today we've had a scholar activist take us through her journey and giving us insights into what she's been doing all of these years. Professor Gadzekpo reminded us of how far we have come as a country, how the media has transformed to what we find now. When she was talking about the numbers, she mentioned 489, I believe, radio stations. And I tried to do some math, 16 regions, that's like 30.5 per region. Of course, we all know that there are probably more stations within the Greater Accra region than many of the other regions that we have. And so every day we have this bombardment of information coming to us. And sometimes we are even not sure how to manage the various information coming from various sources. But she reminded us of the very important role of the media, taking us through the monitorial role, she said the radical role, the facilitative role, the collaborative role, and my favorite, which is the cultural glue role. Because whatever we do, we need to keep, as we globalize and link up with the wider world, we need to be always reminded of what makes us unique. Now, she called for support for the media, which is very important because, as we know, the media plays a critical role in our democracy, often described as the fourth estate of the realm. So definitely the media needs more resources to be able to function properly and adequately. And also call for introspection of the media itself. But Prof, I was wondering also about the ordinary persons that the media in Ghana has now given us all opportunity to participate. So you have people calling in all the time to radio stations, serial callers, occasional callers. Social media has also opened up the space for all of us to participate, and these days you even talk about a citizen journalist. Now, how are we able to cater for all of these? Yes, we can identify the media persons, journalists, and offer training, but for the wider populace that we now participate so actively in the media space, Prof, how do we cater for all of these people? I think that these are thoughts that we don't have the answers now, but we will all go away this evening thinking about these things. She's given us so much food for thought. Prof, I would like to thank you very much this evening for taking the gown to town and telling us what it means to be a scholar activist within the media space. Congratulations, that was very well delivered. And that excites me to even look forward to the other lectures that we have lined up for this semester. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming, and I hope that when we call on you again, you would join us for more exciting lectures. I thank you.
We are grateful to you, Madam Chair, for the beautiful summary you gave us. I hope my colleague students took note of all that, so that you are not found wanting when you are asked anything about Professor Gadzekpo's lecture. Okay, so it's now time for announcements. Before we file out, I have a couple of announcements. But before I move on to that, please let me add my voice again to the VC's voice to thank you once more. Both those who joined us virtually and physically, we are so grateful to you. We thank you that anytime we call you, you respond to us and attend our lectures. As she said, we have a lot of lectures lined up for this academic year. And the next inaugural lecture will be delivered by Professor Chicates, Director of the Institute of African Studies, and it's just 2 weeks away. So please keep the date open. The date is Thursday, 12 May 2022, same time here in the Great Hall. Thursday, 12 May 2022. Please keep the date and time open. Now you want to know the title? We have another exciting title. The road has many stories, encounters between the state and citizens of the different Ghanas. So you want to come and witness what the different Ghanas are. You wouldn't want to miss this one. So we expect all of you on 12 May 2022 here in the Great Hall for Professor Chicates' lecture. Prior to the lecture, there will be an opening ceremony of the exhibition of Prof. Chicates' publications at the BAM Library. And this will take place on 9th May 2022 at 2:30 p.m. It will happen at the BAM Library. A display of her publications. That's what we do. It's characteristic of every inaugural lecture. Before the inaugural lecture, we have a week-long exhibition of the lecturer's publication. And so for Prof. Joji Chicates own, we are having the opening ceremony on 9th May 2022 at the BAM Library, and it will be a week-long affair. So that's for you to note. Now for our refreshments. It's now time for item 13. So for that, we invite all the distinguished guests, the invited guests, to join the platform party at the North Wing, which is to my left here, for refreshments. All students will take their refreshments at the AA Kwapon Quadrangle, which is the forecourt of the Great Hall. For students from Achimota School, we have a special provision for you, so don't you worry. You are special to us. At this point, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, please let's rise for the university anthem.